In this video, I'd like to go ahead and talk about the goal-seeking archetype, which along with the balancing or growth archetype are the two basic archetypes out of which everything else is created. The goal-seeking archetype begins with some desired state, something that you want to come into being, which isn't contrasted with some current state, and the difference between those two creates a gap. That gap then serves as the basis for action intended to move the current state in the direction of the desired state, so that as action moves the current state in that direction, the gap gets smaller and smaller. And once the action has actually achieved its intent of moving the current state to the desired state, the gap is zero, and therefore there's no more basis for action, and action stops. Now, so what you end up with is, as I said, a goal-seeking structure, and the characteristic of this structure is that it is goal-seeking. It attempts to create a balance between the desired state and the current state, and this structure is one that you see constantly without thinking about it. When you wake up in the morning and find yourself in bed and would prefer to be downstairs having breakfast, it's a difference between the desired state and the current state, and all of the actions that you take to get you downstairs having breakfast, no matter how many things you do between the two of them, are all actions intended to move the current state, which is you being in bed, to the desired state, which is downstairs having breakfast. Well, supposedly, at least if you live in a multi-story house. So you can tell a goal-seeking structure because the number of opposite influences in that structure is odd. There may be a multitude of influences in the structure itself, many of them opposite or same, though if you count them and you end up with an odd number of opposing or opposite influences, then it's a goal-seeking structure, often referred to as a balancing structure. Now, the equivalent of this structure, created as a stock and flow simulation model, simply shows the desired state, the current state represented as a stock, the difference between them is a gap, and that gap is the basis for the action intended to move the current state in the direction of the desired state. Here we've added an action factor, which is simply a variable that one can change between 0 and 1 to alter the amount of influence the gap actually has on the action. Action is just the action factor multiplied by the gap. Now, if we initially simulate this with a action factor of 1, the current state reaches the desired state in 1 time period, which is a little bit unrealistic, though it was done specifically for an intent, and that being that the difference between the current state and the desired state is generally something that you can't transition one to the other in a single time cycle. If you think about, I have a project to do that takes 10 person days worth of work, and I have 1 person to do it, I'm not going to get from the current state to the desired state in a day. There aren't enough resources to do that. In this particular situation, the action factor is not a linear limitation, but there are typically varying kinds of limitations on the action, which will show up in the diagram. If we change the action factor to 0.5 and run this, we'll notice that we now have what is the typical goal-seeking structure, where 1 is the goal, the action factor is 0.5, so that the initial action moves the current state from 0 to 0.5, and then as the time steps progress, it moves the current state closer and closer to the goal, and once it reaches the goal, the gap is 0 down here, and there's no further action, and it simply sits there. Now, the chunkiness of this graph is because I've run this with the time step of 1, and therefore it's only calculating the variables every one year, which is what the time thing is set here. So typically you run it at a smaller time step and this curve becomes smoother. And when you experiment with this, which I encourage you to do, to go ahead and go to the model and change the values of the current state, the desired state, and the action factor. And also you can change the simulation time step from 1 to 0.5 to 0.25 and see what kind of an influence that has on the resultant graph. I typically try to do archetypes in a generic form, which is why the desired state is 1 and the current state is 0, as opposed to using any specific situation, because what this does is it gives me an opportunity to investigate the behavior of the structure itself without confusing that behavior with any specific situation. So you'll find in the rest of the archetypes that are done, that is sort of a consistent approach to going ahead and looking at the relationships of the archetype in the most generic form. So as I said, I would encourage you to access the model and actually interact with the structure, and just develop a level of familiarity with the way that the structure behaves. So I hope you found this informative, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.